December 19th, 1944, a converted French army barracks in Verdun. The most powerful generals in the Allied command sat around a table, and not one of them was smiling. 3 days earlier, over 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. The offensive had caught Allied intelligence completely by surprise. American units were being overrun, surrounded, annihilated. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had called this emergency meeting to figure out how to stop the disaster. The situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. If that town fell, German armor could split the Allied armies in two and potentially reach the coast. Eisenhower looked around the table and asked the critical question. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? The room went quiet. Generals stared at maps, calculating logistics, troop movements, supply lines. The distances involved, the winter conditions, the chaos of disengaging units already in combat. Then George Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals turned and stared at him. Some thought he was joking. Others thought he was grandstanding, making promises he couldn't possibly keep. 48 hours to disengage 3 divisions from active combat, rotate an entire army 90 degrees, move over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through snow and ice, and launch a coordinated attack against hardened German positions. It was operationally impossible. Every general in that room knew it. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He wasn't grandstanding. He was the only general in that room who had seen this attack coming, and he had been preparing for it for 11 days. December 9th, 1944. 10 days before the Verdun meeting, Patton's headquarters in Nancy, France. Colonel Oscar Koch walked into Patton's office carrying a stack of intelligence reports that would change the course of the war. Koch was Patton's G2, his chief intelligence officer. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and deeply worried. Koch had been tracking German unit movements across the entire Western Front, and he had noticed something that nobody else seemed to care about. 15 German divisions had vanished. These weren't small units. These were full-strength divisions, including several panzer divisions with hundreds of tanks. They had been pulled off the line and moved somewhere, but Allied intelligence couldn't find them. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the SHAEF, had an explanation. The Germans were holding these divisions in reserve to respond to Allied breakthroughs. Nothing to worry about. Koch didn't buy it. He had been studying German patterns for months. The Wehrmacht didn't hold 15 divisions in reserve just to react. That was offensive strength. That was enough combat power to launch a major attack. Koch spread his maps across Patton's desk. He pointed to the Ardennes forest, the thinly held sector where American divisions were spread across miles of front. General, I believe the Germans are planning a major counteroffensive. The target is here, the Ardennes. Patton studied the maps while Koch laid out his case. The Ardennes was the weakest point in the Allied line. 4 American divisions were holding a front that should have required 12. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested, with narrow roads nearly impossible to navigate in winter. That's exactly why SHAEF wasn't worried. The same terrain that made the Ardennes hard to defend also made it hard to attack. No sane commander would launch a major offensive through that terrain in December. But Koch reminded Patton of something. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that. They had attacked through the Ardennes and reached the English Channel in 6 weeks. It was the campaign that conquered France. Koch had more evidence. German radio traffic had increased dramatically in the sector. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new units arriving. Local civilians reported unusual activity behind German lines. Patton asked Koch a direct question. "If you're right, when does the attack come?" Koch's answer was immediate. "Within the next 2 weeks." Patton picked up the phone and called Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. He laid out Koch's analysis. Bradley listened, but he wasn't convinced. The Schaeff intelligence disagreed. The war was almost over. Germany was beaten. They didn't have the strength for a major offensive. Bradley told Patton not to worry. Patton hung up the phone and looked at Koch. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he gave Koch an order. "Start planning." Over the next 10 days, Patton's staff worked in secret. They developed 3 complete contingency plans for responding to a German offensive in the Ardennes. Each plan was detailed down to the minute. Truck routes calculated, fuel supplies pre-positioned, artillery batteries designated for rapid redeployment, infantry units assigned specific roads and assembly points. The plans covered every variable. If the German attack came from this direction, Third Army would execute Plan A. If from another direction, Plan B. If the situation required a different response, Plan C. Patton's staff thought their general had lost his mind. Third Army was engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region. They were pushing toward Germany. Why were they planning for a defensive emergency 100 miles to the north? Because Patton trusted Oskar Koch more than he trusted Schaeff. On December 12th, Patton held a meeting with his senior commanders. He told them to be ready to disengage on short notice. He didn't tell them why. He just told them to be prepared. His commanders exchanged looks. Disengage from offensive operations they were winning? But they were Patton's men. They followed orders. By December 15th, Third Army was the only major American force with contingency plans for the Ardennes. Every other unit in the Allied line was focused on their own sectors, confident the war would be over by Christmas. 5:30 a.m., December 16th, 1944. German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions. Then the infantry came. Then the tanks. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, smashed into 4 American divisions. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1. Units that had been in quiet sectors for rest suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. Communication lines were cut. Commanders lost contact with their troops. At Schaeff headquarters, the first reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. It took hours for the scope of the disaster to become clear. At Bradley's headquarters, disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Allied intelligence had assured them the Germans were finished. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and positioned in the Ardennes for a quiet introduction to combat, was virtually destroyed. 2 entire regiments surrendered, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. But at Third Army headquarters, the reaction was different. Patton received the first reports and immediately summoned his staff. He looked at Oskar Koch. "You were right. What's their objective?" Koch studied the incoming reports. "Bastogne. They need the road junction. And then Antwerp." Patton nodded. "Get me General Gaffey. We're executing the contingency plans." While every other American headquarters scrambled to understand what was happening, Patton was already giving orders. Third Army began disengaging from combat operations in the Saar. The other generals would spend 3 days trying to figure out how to respond. Patton had figured it out 11 days ago. December 19th, the emergency meeting. Eisenhower had called every senior commander in the theater. The situation was grim, but Eisenhower opened with a statement that surprised some present. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." Eisenhower understood something important. The German army had come out of its defensive positions. It was exposed. If the Allies could respond quickly enough, they could turn disaster into victory. But responding quickly was the problem. Every unit was in the wrong place. The logistics of turning everything around seemed impossible. That's when Eisenhower asked his question. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? The silence stretched. Generals looked at their maps, calculated distances. Then Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours, 3 divisions in 72. The room went quiet. Patton was known for aggressive promises, but this seemed beyond aggressive. This seemed delusional. Eisenhower pressed him. George, this is no time for grandstanding. The 101st Airborne is surrounded. If we promise relief and can't deliver, those men die. Patton didn't blink. Ike, I've already given the orders. Third Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans prepared. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days. The other generals stared. Expecting it? How could Patton have expected something that caught Schaeff completely by surprise? Eisenhower studied Patton for a long moment. He had known Patton for decades. He knew when Patton was bluffing and when he was serious. Patton was serious. All right, George, get moving. Patton left the Verdun meeting and made one phone call. He reached his chief of staff at Third Army headquarters. The message was brief. Play ball. Those 2 words activated contingency plans prepared 11 days earlier. Within minutes, orders flowed through Third Army's communication network. The 4th Armored Division began moving north. The 26th Infantry Division followed. The 82nd Infantry Division prepared to disengage and redeploy. Truck convoys that had been pre-positioned started loading troops. Artillery batteries began displacing to new positions. Supply depots shifted from supporting offensive operations to supporting a relief attack toward Bastogne. Over 133,000 vehicles would move through snow, ice, and narrow roads. Supply lines running east were redirected north. Units in combat that morning would be in combat again 100 miles away within days. The other Allied armies watched in disbelief. They were still trying to figure out what was happening in the Ardennes. Third Army was already responding. Every route had been planned, every contingency considered, every supply cache positioned. Patton wasn't performing a miracle, he was executing a plan. The movement began on the night of December 19th and continued without pause. Imagine turning an army, not a battalion, an entire army. Over 100,000 men, thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all moving simultaneously, all arriving at the right place at the right time. The weather was brutal. Snow, ice, freezing temperatures. Vehicles broke down. Men suffered frostbite. But the movement continued. By December 21st, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were in position. They had moved over 100 miles in less than 48 hours, through the worst winter weather in decades, while disengaging from combat operations. December 22nd, 3rd Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division drove north toward Bastogne. The fighting was brutal. German forces had established defensive positions along every approach to the surrounded town. Every mile was contested. Tank battles erupted in frozen fields. Infantry fought through forests and villages. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held on, low on ammunition, low on food, low on medical supplies. On December 22nd, the Germans demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous one-word reply. Nuts! The paratroopers weren't giving up. They knew relief was coming. December 26th, 1944, 4:50 p.m. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank Cobra King, pushed through the final German positions at Assenois. His tank made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. Patton received the news and immediately called Eisenhower. "We're through to Bastogne." The relief corridor was narrow. German forces attacked the flanks continuously. But Third Army held. That night, supply convoys rolled into Bastogne. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. The 101st Airborne had held for 8 days against overwhelming odds. Now they had what they needed to keep fighting. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month. The Germans hadn't achieved their strategic objectives, but they had inflicted massive casualties. Over 19,000 Americans killed, over 47,000 wounded, another 23,000 captured or missing. The bloodiest battle the American Army fought in World War II. But the losses would have been far worse without Patton's relief of Bastogne. If the 101st Airborne had been overrun, if the Germans had captured that road junction, the offensive might have succeeded in splitting the Allied armies. The intelligence failure haunted American command. How had over 200,000 German troops achieved complete surprise? How had 15 divisions vanished without anyone noticing? The answer was simple and damning. Someone had noticed. Oskar Koch had tracked those divisions. He had predicted the offensive. He had identified the target. But Schaeff had dismissed his analysis. The conventional wisdom said Germany was beaten. A major offensive was impossible. Only Patton had listened. Only Patton had prepared. And when the attack came, only Patton was ready. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German commanders about their planning for the Ardennes offensive. The Germans had expected to reach the Meuse River within 4 days. They had expected to take Antwerp within 2 weeks. They had expected the American response to be slow, confused, disorganized. What they hadn't expected was George S. Patton. German commanders admitted that Patton's counterattack disrupted their entire timetable. The speed of Third Army's response shocked them. They had calculated it would take the Americans at least a week to mount a serious counteroffensive. It took Patton 4 days. General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to Rundstedt, wrote in a post-war study that Patton was the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, was more specific. "We knew Patton would react quickly. We didn't know he had prepared for our attack. When his counteroffensive hit us, we realized someone on the American side had anticipated exactly what we were doing. That someone was Oskar Koch. But he was working for George Patton, and that made all the difference. George Patton received no medal for the relief of Bastogne, no special recognition. The official histories praised Third Army's performance, but rarely mentioned the 11 days of preparation that made it possible. Oskar Koch remained largely unknown outside military intelligence circles. His prediction of the Ardennes offensive, one of the most accurate intelligence assessments of the war, was overshadowed by the larger story of surprise and recovery. But within the military, the lesson was clear. Intelligence only matters if commanders act on it. Preparation only works if leaders trust their planners. Schaiff's intelligence failure wasn't about incompetence, it was about assumptions. The analysts had decided the war was almost over. They interpreted every piece of evidence through that assumption. Oskar Koch approached the evidence differently. He didn't assume the war was over. He asked what the evidence actually showed. But having good intelligence wasn't enough. Other commanders received Koch's analysis. Bradley was briefed. Schaiff saw the reports. They all dismissed them. Patton didn't dismiss them. He trusted his intelligence officer. He prepared for the possibility that Koch was right and everyone else was wrong. At the Verdun meeting, the other generals stared in disbelief when Patton said 48 hours. They thought he was grandstanding. He wasn't. He was telling them something they should have known themselves. The Battle of the Bulge was a failure of intelligence at the highest levels. But it was also a story of one general who listened when no one else would. That's why Patton was the only general ready for the Battle of the Bulge. Not because he was lucky, not because he was reckless, because he was prepared. And in war, preparation is everything.